Thanks very much to Concilium and to Lisa specifically for inviting me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the way that the National Cancer Institute is involved in clinical research in the United States and actually to some degree globally, because we do have trials that actually extend outside the US as well. The main way that it does so is actually through my program, and I've been fortunate over the past decade or so to be involved with, in particular, the growth of immunotherapy throughout oncology, which has really been scientifically and clinically actually quite gratifying. But today, and for the purposes of this talk, I think that we're really just going to focus on structure, but I can give some more specific examples, and so there will be some time for discussion with members of the panel, and I just wanted to give a little bit of background of more or less where we are and what we do. As Lisa stated quite correctly, I work at the Cancer Therapy Evaluation Program, which is a critical part of the National Cancer Institute. It's involved in what we call the extramural community, which means everything outside the walls of the NIH. The NCI is one of the components of the National Institutes of Health. It is one of the institutes the government likes to do that in the US. A lot of people think of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, but actually it's the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And we also are similar with the National Institutes of Health, and the NCI is actually the biggest institute within that framework of the NIH. So CTEP, which again is my part of the NCI, it also is housed within the Division of Cancer Treatment and Diagnosis, DCTD. The mission for CTEP is to find better ways to treat, control, and cure cancer. Very wonderful laudatory goals that any organization like ours should have. To do that, we support an extensive national program of clinical cancer research. We're the funder and the sponsor of clinical trials to help evaluate new anti-cancer agents and establish new standards of care. This is a major difference from some of our colleagues across the pond. The NCI, through CTEP, actually sponsors the overwhelming majority of its clinical trials, which means essentially that we have contracts with industry in order to get agents into our portfolio. And those contracts do give them some control over their intellectual property, but it means that we have a collaborative effort, and that before regulatory agencies, and particularly the FDA, it is the NCI that is the lead in discussing issues of concern with those regulatory agencies, and not the pharmaceutical company for those trials that we are sponsoring. That doesn't mean that we sponsor the majority of cancer clinical trials in the United States. That's not at all the case, but we do sponsor quite a few, and with multiple pharmaceutical collaborators providing agents for which we can conduct that sponsorship and funding of those clinical research projects. So we have a particular emphasis on translational research to help elucidate molecular targets and biomarkers, as well as mechanisms of drug targets. In general, as I was mentioning before, when we talk about money that's going to the rest of the world, or a sponsorship that's going outside of our Bethesda, Maryland location, we call that extramural. Anything that's happening again within the walls of the NCI, we call it intramural. We have a relatively big intramural program at the NCI. It's about 16% of our total budget, which is somewhere on the order of $6 billion. And the Division of Cancer Treatment and Diagnosis is actually, like I said, I think the biggest division within the NCI, and probably has over $1 billion of funding altogether. The clinical translational research program essentially has what you might expect if you're trying to bring your study of cancer biology from the bedside to the bench and back. The ideal is that we use clinical observations, functional imaging, tumor and tissue pharmacodynamic markers, CTC, ctDNA, what have you, to help determine what we should study next, to help determine also which patients should be eligible for our early phase clinical trials, analyze our tumors and other tissues for pathway activation or biomarkers, and to help assign patients to trials based on molecular characterization of tumors and related activities. And I'll describe this, I think, actually in the next slide maybe a little bit better, but my program is actually a component of the division. And so we actually administer all the extramural clinical trial networks that the NCI essentially funds. That includes the NCTN, and you've probably heard of some of these groups. So the National Clinical Trials Network, that's what that stands for, includes the Radiation Therapy Oncology Group, which was consolidated into another group, SWOG, ECOG-ACRIN, the Alliance for Clinical Trials in Oncology, and Children's Oncology Group. And all of these are actually grant-supported networks in major universities that then encompass, in each case, probably about 250 or so main sites, both in academic locations, again, throughout the United States and Canada, certainly, and also around the world, but also in community sites, particularly in the United States. They all have internal scientific committees and external steering committees. The early phase work is actually focused more at academic sites, obviously. That's run out of my branch in particular, the investigational drug branch within CTEP. And we gave it a name, Experimental Therapeutics Clinical Trials Network, but you can think of it as just the early phase network. And we have a number of other groups that one could call specialty groups. Three of the ones that I'm listing here are pediatric. P stands for pediatric, so the Pediatric Cancer Immunotherapy Trials Network, Pediatric Experimental Therapeutics, Experimental Phase Clinical Trials Network, rather, and the Pediatric Brain Tumor Consortium. We also have an adult immunotherapy-focused network called the Cancer Immunotherapy Trials Network, but many trials that we do now are immunotherapy because that's really pervaded a lot of oncology of late. So at any given time, we probably sponsor about 300 actively accruing trials. A third of them are phase 2 or 3. So we have sometimes trials that are designed actually with a phase 2 component and a phase 3 component if they meet their endpoint, or just directly to phase 3 trials. About 20,000 patients are enrolled per year on all our CTEP-funded networks. And as a CTEP physician, I am involved with trial selection, trial design, and clearly study oversight and pharmacovigilance as well. So just to give you kind of an idea of how this sort of fits, you can see where CTEP are the Center for Cancer Research. That's essentially the intramural component, the Division of Cancer Prevention, which are our colleagues that are focused obviously more also prevention and mitigation of side effects, as well as my Division of Cancer Treatment and Diagnosis. And so for CTEP, just again, give kind of a framework of how complicated and extensive this has to be. This is a picture of the NCI Shady Grove circa November 2021. I guess that's where a lot of the CTEP extramural activities are actually based. It's technically in Rockville, Maryland, but the address Bethesda, Maryland works just fine. My branch here is in red, made up entirely of physicians that focus on different therapeutic areas. Clinical and Investigations branch is the branch that has more disease-specific areas of an expert on lymphoma and leukemia, expert on breast cancer, things of that nature. So as I mentioned, so we have about 12 physicians in the investigational drug branch. about 8 in the clinical investigations branch that have portfolios of diseases. So the investigational drug branch, as it may sound, we have portfolios of investigational agents, focus on early stage studies, but we all work pretty collaboratively. And then those INDs allow CTEP to act as those, CTEP INDs rather, allow CTEP to act as a sponsor of clinical trials within its funded networks. These essentially create three-way partnerships between the pharmaceutical collaborator, for the most part, academic investigators, and the NCI. We do rarely actually have some drugs or treatments that actually come directly from either academia or actually from research at the NCI, and so that also allows us to have something of an outgrowth that doesn't necessarily involve an outside pharmaceutical partner. Well, we go further on. So this makes up about, for the collaborative research and development agreements, about 134 of them, last count. Essentially, these are CRADAs, it stands for Collaborative Research and Development Agreements, but these are essentially contracts that allow for the sharing of intellectual property between academic investigators, the NCI, and the pharmaceutical companies, and also allow us to share funds. So if the pharmaceutical companies want to actually assist and provide some payment to the government, this structure allows for that to occur. Whereas clinical trial agreements, CTAs, which was an older mechanism by which we did those contracts, didn't really allow for that. So all the funding actually had to just come from the NCI directly. So we have about 80 IND treatment trials that were open between 2018 and 2020, many of which involve combinations. So when we have a contract, for instance, a CRADA with, let's say, a company, let's just say Merck or MSD outside the US, and then we need to use another drug from another company, we don't need a separate contract. Both the CRADAs with those individual companies allow for further combinations. As long as it's all mutually agreeable, we don't negotiate something ad hoc for each trial. So that by itself, I think, is actually something of a benefit to pharmaceutical companies that want to work with us. We have, but you know, this slide talks about some of the other things that make it easy. So we have an entry portal for new drugs that come into the CTEP portfolio. We call it the NCI Experimental Therapeutics Program, or NEXT. It's available at next.cancer.gov if you're interested in looking at it. That helps us provide to companies novel agents from competitors that they might be able to allow for combinations with, again, without having an agreement, a separate agreement to do so, because they only need the agreement with the honest broker, specifically the NCI, in a sense. There are some potential therapeutic indications that they don't have a high enough priority for within the companies themselves. And so having access to CTEP and the CTEP network of investigators actually allows them to sometimes conduct trials that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do on their own, or wouldn't be able to do very quickly on their own. So we can expend these public funds for those clinical trials and also provide regulatory support to advance the development of agents that happen to be owned by pharmaceutical collaborators. As I mentioned, we have large networks of experienced clinical trialists and centralized clinical trial support systems, and that certainly helps considerably in allowing for further drug development. That's another reason that companies care to work with us. And then further, we invest greatly in correlative science studies, specifically to explore pharmacodynamics of agents in clinical studies, especially in early phase trials within, like I mentioned, the early phase network, the ETCTN. So we recognize, or at least believe, that there's a significant public interest in finding indications for new oncology drugs beyond those that might be the most profitable. So you can think to some degree of CTEP as being part of the effort by the US government to help prioritize rare cancer drug discovery and research. And we also help understand cancer biology and treatment through carefully designed clinical trials through correlative studies that are extensively incorporated into, in particular, ETCTN trials. So here's just a short list of some of the high priority targets that we've had recently in our portfolio. I think this has actually changed since this very, very nice graphic actually was created, but you can still see and get a sense of the involvement that we've had. Is just an example. I have pembrolizumab and atezolizumab. I have colleagues that work with durvalumab and nivolumab. Those are the PD-1 and PD-L1 agents that modulate T-cell activity in particular and have really transformed oncology of late. But numerous other molecules on the immunotherapy side. Here's an example of recombinant IL-12 and recombinant IL-15. These are two interleukins that the NCI actually produced ourselves. And so there is no drug company that works with us for those two agents. As just an example, we made them. Sometimes we actually combine them with other agents in clinical trials to see if that might be beneficial. But we have numerous other targets that have been looked at and developed in a decades-long history. So we provide funding for network operations for our clinical trial networks, infrastructure support for all our clinical trials. As an example, we fund our central IRB for the trials that are conducted entirely in the US. We don't fund IRBs outside the US, but work with partners on that. And we also, as I noted, act as the sponsor, certainly for all our early phase trials. So we have a number of different cores that support either CTEP trials or in this case, the Division of Cancer Prevention trials, but other CTEP staff that help the extramural community conduct trials, both in terms of the information security, study administration, logistics, clinical data capture, correlative study data, regulatory monitoring, and quality control. I'll skip through these quickly because I think that won't be the source of our main discussion. But we also, as I noted earlier, have been funding now for several years for CIRB boards, so the early phase emphasis, late phase emphasis, adult central IRBs, as well as the pediatric CIRB, and for the Division of Cancer Prevention, there's a Cancer Prevention and Control CIRB. So most of our registered investigators be able essentially to submit clinical trials through our Protocol and Information Office. Those involve the ETCTN investigators that are funded grant PIs. They can submit letters of intent, LOIs, for review and approval. We also have ways that other cancer center investigators can send in LOIs. And the NCTN groups, the National Clinical Trial Network groups, those are much larger organizations in a sense. Like I noted, they have about 250 sites each, more or less, give or take. And so they have internal scientific committees that then submit either letters of intent if they're smaller than 100 patients and generally larger than 100 patients. They go to concepts that go to CTEP as well, but then there's a disease-specific steering committee that provides some additional help and expertise. One of the more recent cancer moonshot funding initiatives that we've had is the Nci Virtual Formulary. So we've been able to make it so that although we don't give funding attached to this, we can actually help investigators that are interested in just getting access to drugs in our portfolio and don't want to go through the contracting process with pharmaceutical companies. They can apply if they're within the United States and ask for access to a given agent through the NCI, what's called the NCI formulary. I actually call it the NCI Virtual Formulary, just to avoid confusion with our own work, but we do support that as well. It can be termed skeleton CTEP because we don't provide IND support for that. We don't provide any funding, but we do distribute the agent, and the contract is basically already in place if the drug company is interested in proceeding with the investigators. So I think I'm going to go ahead and stop here just to allow for further discussion, if that's okay with you, Lisa, because I do have additional slides and I can go over some of the work that we're doing, but I think it might be somewhat more in the weeds for many of the participants. And so I just wanted to have that in my back pocket, but I'm happy to just talk about issues that might be of concern for Consilium in comparisons with other government funders.
Thank you so much, Elad. We do come across NCI funded trials. So my first question to you would be, what is the decision-making process in order which trials to do? What trials are given priority? Is it because industry contacts you, or you have some prioritization list, and where does it come from? Like, who defines the topics? Who sets the questions?
Right. So for the most part, these are coming, I'd say 90% or so are coming actually from academia. And so certainly academics are actually getting influence and suggestions sometimes from industry representatives. So I can't say that there's no involvement. And clearly, if there's no direct involvement with the prioritization in a sense, but clearly there is a lead academic concern that leads to submission of a particular concept, and it is a collaborative effort. When companies actually have access to or their own intellectual property, they obviously have quite an interest in conducting this kind of work, and so they're not going to propose a 1,000 person clinical trial without probably talking to the company first. So I acknowledge that. But classically in our system, most of the proposals that officially are coming from academics directly. When we bring agents into the portfolio through the NCI Experimental Therapeutics program, that may involve more direct discussions with the companies about what their priorities are and where we might be able to complement an area of interest for a given company. Just as an example, this was relatively early on with PD-1 therapies. When BMS and both BMS and Merck actually came into the portfolio at about the same time with their respective agents, those agents essentially were tasked with everything other than their main priorities. And so, BMS said, we're running our own lung cancer trials, don't do lung cancer trials. And so we didn't consider those. But obviously that's an area, PD-1 was actually so broadly beneficial to so many different kinds of cancer histologies, at least potentially, that wasn't necessarily a problem. And it allowed us, I think, to increase the reach of the type of work that BMS, Merck, ultimately Genentech and AstraZeneca were able to conduct within our networks.
Mm-hmm. So Elad, just a quick request, if you could stop sharing the screen, this way we can see everyone and I can see if people raise their hands to ask questions. I do have follow-up questions, but there is a question from Sophia. Do you want to go ahead and ask it, or you can read it in chat?
Hi. Yeah, I just popped it in the chat. Thank you so much for this little talk. Yes, it's really fascinating that you've come up with this idea to fund trials that otherwise might not have or might not get the sponsorship they require. I was just interested to know a little bit about the details of the collaboration in terms of who owns the data and what happens if the NCI want to run some particular analysis of this data. Can you suggest so, or how can you do this retrospectively?
Yeah, certainly. I think it depends on what type of data you're talking about, and certainly the agreements that we have do allow or give the right of review to companies that are working with us. So, that's important to note. But we consider the investigators to be the entity that would own the data, so to speak. And for the most part, when we're conducting these publicly sponsored trials and publicly funded trials, we also see it as our role to essentially act as public stewards. So there's a time limit, in a sense, for many of the things that we're doing. And it's very similar to the way that the NIH thinks about publications. That's just an example. We have PubMed Central, which I'm sure you're familiar with. If anything is funded by the NCI after a year, it's been published, let's say in JCO, maybe not open access, but after a year, it gets deposited into PubMed Central for access. So it's not an immediate open access, but that's the type of thought process essentially that we have more or less with the clinical trial data, with samples that are collected in the clinical trials. There are limits essentially to even the investigators that are conducting the work as to who owns those samples and when those can be actually accessed by other entities. So if even samples that are collected on our clinical trials are only reserved, as it were, for the investigators who were conducting the trials for up to 6 months after the primary presentation or primary publication. After that point, we have a different committee that basically decides whether or not an agent can or should be used, samples rather can or should be used for a particular purpose when somebody wants access to them. So that's sort of the mentality or the framework that we use for access. Obviously, any sequencing that we do on our clinical trials eventually has to go into some sort of public sequencing database, right? So dbGaP is one example, but those are requirements for receiving our funding to a large extent. Now, even years earlier, if you've conducted a trial, you're doing some sort of meta-analysis with patient-level data that you've obtained access to, we still give it to the original IP holder. I think sometimes even after they've already gone into the generic phase occasionally. But that is really just for review and comments, not ownership. And it's not meant to be owned by the companies. Any inventions, however, occurring or arising from our clinical trials, that's a little bit more complicated, but the unrestricted license can occur, for instance, from 2 companies that are competitors in the market. Those can actually occur on clinical trials for either party. And that's a little bit more complicated and maybe beyond my expertise as a poor medical oncologist and not a legal intellectual property specialist. But I'd be happy to direct you to the right folks at the NCI to discuss that further. That doesn't help Consilium, I guess, today, but it's a more extensive discussion.
Okay. Any other questions for Elad? While people are thinking of questions, we have a question from John. Yeah, I'll ask mine after you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Elad, for that run through of the system there. I want to ask about combinations, which you mentioned, when the drugs come from different companies. And this has always been a problem in the past. Can you tell me about how you deal with this? So if you're talking to 2 different pharmaceutical companies, is this a common occurrence?
It is, yeah. I can't be sure right now, but at one point we were the largest single global sponsor of combination clinical trials in oncology from different, entities, from different groups. That's probably still true because I don't think very many folks end up doing this in terms of sponsorship. So what essentially happens is that when we write these collaborative research and development agreements, any entity that is giving us an agent for us to work with, number one, they can say no. I want to be totally clear. They own the IP. They have a veto over anything that we're doing. So there's no real risk to them in a sense that where they would actually be forced to doing a trial they don't want to do, or they don't want their agent, combined with. They have a right of refusal in that sense, even with our contract. But in terms of IP, we believe that the IP option that we provide to these companies does protect their intellectual property and allows them to proceed safely without feeling like just because an AstraZeneca compound is combined with a Merck compound on a single clinical trial, that somehow gives total access to the respective competitors to steal each other's intellectual property. It's shared, whatever is created, and we don't have separate contracts because it's actually built into our original contract with the IP holder that we would be able to do these trials. Able, again, doesn't mean that we force anyone to do these trials. We don't force anyone to do anything.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Elad. My comment and question follow from this last phrase you've said. When we talk about oncology specifically, there is we're always unhappy with the quality of clinical research that goes for registrational trials. They're not either long enough, these trials, or they're not they don't have proper comparator arm. So, and there's plenty of work that can be done in the public sector to answer clinically relevant questions. And for example, a research system in the UK, there is a push to try to run some of these trials to answer these questions for public health, for better use of resources, for example, encouraging trials on de-escalation for optimal use. It's definitely not being done at the level it should be done, I don't think, in any country. But my controversial statement or question to you, would that be fair to say that NCI is there to satisfy curiosity of academics rather than resolve public health pressing clinical questions? Or both kind of collaborate? Oh, that's why I asked you my first question, because I completely understand there is a application process, how an academic wants to get funding from NCI, it has to be credible trial. And my question was, who is deciding what's important? Who is prioritizing? So is this just kind of a pot of money to satisfy curiosity of clinicians, or there is this really agenda? And that would lead, maybe you can connect it to the next thing. I don't know what's going on with PCORI at the moment, with whether it still exists, how the trials that they ran were different from trials that NCI runs. So I hope you see where I'm getting to in terms of answering clinically relevant questions and where NCI stands with this.
Certainly. So I think that, it depends. There are different levels of authority, so to speak, but we're not geared or created essentially to, at least not in my opinion, to just satisfy the curiosity of academics. The goal essentially is, like I said, within the mission statement of the NCI, to cure, mitigate side effects, prevent cancer overall. And so we're on the side of the cure, treatment, or at least prevent recurrence of cancer with some of our large adjuvant trials as just an example. There are certain limitations. One could not, for instance, do a trial where you're looking at length of therapy, length of, for instance, PD-1 therapy, if the company is providing us with the drug and the company says no. Maybe they want to give a drug for a year because somehow they think that cancer responds better to a circle around the sun than finding the best time frame for adjuvant therapy post-surgery, right? It's almost traditional at this point that we treat for adjuvant therapy for a year. There's no science behind that. And so people can legitimately ask, why are we doing it? So if we're getting the drug from the drug company, then the drug company can basically say no. However, if the drug company already got an approval, then we can actually conduct the same clinical trial that we would want to, but with the drug paid for by insurance, because there are laws in the United States that say that if you are participating in a clinical trial, an insurance must pay for all the normal standard of care issues on that clinical trial. So if you wanted to do a length of therapy PD-1 adjuvant trial at any point, that is something that feasibly we can do, and we are doing some length of therapy trials, duration of therapy, specifically for that reason. Now, you can't do that for everything. You also have to make a decision as to what is your goal, because ultimately, pot of money, big or small, it's finite. And so you still have to make some sort of prioritization, some sort of decision. And so we have multiple ways of doing that. I alluded to it, but just at a high level. Obviously, so I'm part of the protocol review committee at CTAP. That's the core way that decisions are made. The head of CTAP is currently named Meg Mooney. She's sits at head of that committee, and she's responsible essentially for anything coming out of that our committee, based on all these different experts that are across the table reviewing and giving their opinions as to whether or not it's appropriate to treat patients and give a particular protocol life within our networks. That said, above us, so to speak, are disease-specific steering committees that are made up mostly of academics. There are patient advocates as well on all of these committees. But they're essentially like the Brain Malignancy Steering Committee, the Breast Cancer Steering Committee, the GI Steering Committee, the Leukemia Lymphoma Steering Committee. And so all these very major areas, and if we have a large trial, they would go to those disease-specific committees as long as there's a standing committee. If there is no standing committee, we create one ad hoc for specific proposals. So melanoma, much to the chagrin of many folks, does not have a standing committee because for many, many years before PD-1 therapies, we didn't have very much going on in the melanoma space. And so as a result, we just never happened to set one up. And then of course, now melanoma has quite a lot happening in it. And so therefore, we have these ad hoc steering committees much more often, but we still have maintained it as an ad hoc steering committee. There's also the question about who decides what drugs are coming into our portfolio. And so that is where the next comes in, that next portal that I mentioned, the NCI Experimental Therapeutics Program. That's really just meant to be a way by which companies or indeed academic investigators can apply to utilize our contract resources. They don't apply for funding. We very rarely, although we have done it in the past, but we very rarely actually give money out through that system. But we do give funding, and so that funding via these grants and contracts. So what that essentially means is, if we realize that we need to do early tox studies, we'll do the contract for the early tox study to help a biotech startup that has a really promising agent that our next subcommittee thinks we need to invest in. But that next subcommittee, again, it's external, intentionally so. It's made up of industry and academic volunteers, essentially. They come in and I guess once a trimester, well, there are 3 of them per year, every 4 months, to debate whether or not the given applicants in the next program should be added to either our discovery pathway, which would be all preclinical, or our development pathway, which obviously is all clinical in terms of clinical development and clinical trials.
Thank you so much. So any other questions from the audience? I have a follow-up, like more clarification question. I don't know if you have an answer for it, but maybe as a practicing physician, you can answer. So for example, if you did run a dose optimization study and you say, okay, we don't need to give trastuzumab for a year, we can give it for 3 months, you have compelling evidence, really good data, this probably would be extremely interesting to the insurance company, since they don't have to pay for this drug, but let's say the label is different. What happens? Do you have examples of when NCI actually ran a trial after the drug was on the market already, and where clinical practice or prescription or reimbursement through insurance changed?
Oh, I don't know about reimbursement changing. I think that reimbursement usually stays the same, but there are certainly, from the insurance company perspective, you're right that they would probably be interested. I guess I haven't seen a situation, so we've definitely run these trials in the past, that I know. I think some years ago, there was a 2-year versus 1-year HER2 trial, if I'm not mistaken, and we're currently running some PD-1 trials where we're looking at length of therapy, and others are in development. So there are definitely length of therapy trial and questions that are in the works, but in terms of how that affects the U.S. insurance framework, I don't know. I know you're right that in a sense there's an interest in it, a financial interest, if patients did not need further therapy. But, it's funny, those trials are very difficult to conduct for a lot of reasons. One of them is that, even if we say we're going to give this drug for about a year to patients, not everyone gets it. Even if your plan is to get it, we give it for about a year, right? Because people come off because their tumor progresses or recurs, because they have a toxicity, because they just don't want any more therapy, because they changed insurance and lost insurance. Anything can happen. So when we do analyses ourselves, the United States is actually fortunate with the insurance issue, I admit, but when we do our analyses ourselves, it's a significant minority that actually end up getting the planned whatever period of time you're looking at, if it's a prolonged duration of therapy. And that certainly affects your ability to conduct these trials, because if you wanted to randomize a priori and make that determination, you have that as a particular limitation, the fact that ultimately you're really just going to be comparing a fraction of the patients that you originally enrolled to each arm. The other problem, of course, is that patients can drop off, right? If somebody's on a trial for something that's actually approved for their insurance, and then they get nervous towards that cutoff point, they can say, I'm off the trial. And then they just get, even in an intention to treat analysis, they can get the therapy that is technically FDA approved and available and potentially paid for by their insurance. So that's something to work out as well. But overall, those types of efforts are really just dependent on the treating clinician to a large extent, because the clinician has to have the belief in equipoise, meaning that they have to believe that this or that is the appropriate therapy for these patients. And I've certainly seen trials that in a variety of different settings that unfortunately have basically failed on the equipoise standpoint, even if from the community physician perspective, meaning after we move forward, no one's enrolling the patients. And the reason why they're not enrolling the patients is because there's a belief amongst the treating community that one of the options really is better than the other. And that certainly complicates matters. I can't say that it's more common necessarily for those trials that we run that don't have a pharma collaborator. But in general, it can certainly be an issue, and it's something that pervades our field, to be honest. In fact, we were just discussing before this call a neoadjuvant concept of using a couple of drugs prior to surgery for a particular cancer with a lot of surgical poor outcomes. Unfortunately, in that particular case, and I won't identify the trial, you couldn't get patients on the trial because everyone at the treating center wants to give the patients chemotherapy first. And so now I can't prove that chemotherapy first before surgery is better because everyone's already made that decision themselves. And that's a definite problem for some of, frankly, I would say some of the very interesting and clinically relevant questions, because I don't want to delay surgery for somebody who, wouldn't necessarily benefit from the chemo. But, now and in certain areas, when something becomes standard of care, or is the perceived standard of care anyway, it makes it very hard to actually conduct the research.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. And I think it's really leads me to the next question. In order to get funding from NCI, do you have to be an American researcher, American academic, or is it possible that someone from UK applies, or they have to have an American partner?
For most of the grants, we do need some sort of American partner. We do have a long-standing with Princess Margaret Hospital in Canada. It's probably going on several decades. And so they're actually critical members and have been for a long time of the Experimental Therapeutics Clinical Trials Network. There are also other sites around the around the world that do participate in our clinical trials through our cooperative groups. So the cooperative groups are the ones actually getting the funding. So as an example, the Alliance for Clinical Trials in Oncology, led by Monica Bertinelli. She is at Harvard, at Brigham and Women's. Another portion of it, I think the Statistical Data Center, is actually at the University of Chicago. They jointly receive a grant, a rather large grant, that then helps fund the whole network all over the United States and all over the world. Many of our larger networks have partners that are located everywhere. So it's just an example. The Children's Oncology Group has Australia and New Zealand as really critical partners that enroll on our clinical trials and have for many years. Also, Switzerland is in the Children's Oncology Group. We had membership from Saudi Arabia, Israel, Ireland in the ECOG Akron group. Many sites are members of, are from Canada. Many site members in the cooperative groups are from Canada because they've just been really well integrated into our US cooperative groups for just many years. We've had particular problems with Europe. We do have some efforts that are ongoing with Europe. Like I mentioned, Ireland, which has full member sites, but there's another trial we're working on with Germany right now. However, those are almost limited one-off collaborations. And the reason is because the structure is entirely different, but also because in Europe, there's a regulation, I think, called the qualified agent or qualified person regulation that basically states that if you don't fulfill these particular requirements, you cannot ship to any European or EU site. That has been a complicating matter because our Rockville, Maryland repositories of our drugs obviously are not certified as qualified agents, and so therefore, and we're not able to make that adjustment. And so therefore, we've never really been able to ship without a very complicated process into Europe, sometimes involving the pharmaceutical collaborator. And it's very odd because, we ship drug basically all over the world. We ship drug to Japan and Korea. In fact, several drugs have actually been approved in those countries on the basis of clinical trials that we're conducting internationally. And our pharma partners are sometimes very happy to have that opportunity to sort of conduct a large international clinical trial that's largely US based, but involves some centers in Korea and Japan. regardless, EU has just been a real problem. And if anything, I believe that at one point, I believe Obama administration was talking about the EU-US trade agreement and about how most of the problems that we have between EU and US trade were actually more about regulatory issues and not about tariffs. And I couldn't agree more. And this is certainly an example. We're just unable to make trials happen in Europe to the extent that we can in nearly any other country around the world.
Fascinating. We just have a few minutes left. I have a final question for you. So if you can answer it without putting your job at risk. So my question to you is, what do you wish NCI was doing, which is currently not doing?
No, there are several things. So I think I just mentioned one. I actually believe, that particularly for rare cancer drug development, we would do much better if we cooperated more closely with the EU. And so that's, for me, a disappointment. And it's not without various attempts, at least on our part, to deal with partners from Europe. We have very close relationships, actually, with the EORTC, but we're not able to do it to the extent that we'd like to. Similarly, I think that we could be doing a lot more with adverse event research. I staked a lot of my personal work in that area. I have a couple of one publication coming at ASCO and another major poster, I think, looking at our adverse events, specifically on PD-1 and PD-L1 inhibitors. And I think that that is a good public use of this type of resource, given the fact that we have multiple sponsors and many studies that we could draw from. And so that's also something that I think is disappointing that we could be doing better. And then, lastly, and I think something that you would have a lot of interest in, is that we are probably well geared to be a partner with a lot of health technology assessment related questions. We do work with our colleagues, BCCPF, the Division of Cancer Control and Population Sciences, on issues like the pro-CTCE, patient-reported outcome adverse event mechanism that we have. That would feed well into a lot of the HTA assessments that many European countries require for approval and funding of a given drug, and it would actually also further enhance collaboration and teach us a lot more about the benefits that we're providing to patients. And so from at least a health economist perspective, I think that it's unfortunate that we aren't making more of an effort to incorporate that into our clinical trials. And I don't think it would actually cost that much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Elad. So there's way to improve on for all of us. So once again, very much appreciate your time for joining us.